The day everything changed. The galactic assembly chamber stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian floor, its crystalline walls reaching toward a dome that displayed the swirling cosmos above. Representatives from 437 species sat in their designated zones, each area carefully climate-controlled and atmosphere-adjusted for their particular biology. The Zephyrians floated in their gas-filled bubbles, the rock-like granites stood motionless on heated platforms, and the ethereal luminants flickered like living starlight in their energy containment fields. At the center of it all sat the human delegation, 12 individuals in simple dark blue uniforms that looked almost primitive compared to the elaborate environmental suits and biomechanical enhancements of the other species. Ambassador Sarah Chen sat at the head of the human table, her weathered hands folded calmly as she listened to the debate raging around her. The topic of today's emergency session was the same one that had been discussed for the past 3 standard galactic months: the Void Plague. A mysterious disease that consumed entire star systems, turning planets into empty husks and leaving behind nothing but cold, dead space. It had already claimed 17 systems across the outer rim, and it was spreading. High Chancellor Vextar of the Hegemony rose from his crystalline throne, his insectoid features gleaming under the chamber's artificial light. His voice, translated through the universal communicators, carried the weight of authority that came from representing the most powerful alliance in known space. "Honored delegates," Vextar began, his mandibles clicking with emphasis. "We have gathered here today to address the final solution to the Void Plague crisis. Our scientific collective has determined that the only viable option is complete quarantine and elimination of all infected systems." A murmur rippled through the assembly. The Aquatic Confederation's representative, speaking through a water-filled translation device, voiced what many were thinking. "High Chancellor, you speak of 23 billion sentient lives across those systems. Surely there must be alternatives." Vextar's compound eyes focused on the speaker with cold precision. "The greater good demands sacrifice. Our models show that any attempt at evacuation or treatment will only spread the plague further. The infected systems must be sterilized with quantum fire. Every planet, every moon, every asteroid. Nothing can remain." Sarah Chen felt her jaw tighten. She had been silent through most of these debates, watching as species after species fell in line with the hegemony's brutal efficiency. But this was different. This was genocide on a scale that made humanity's darkest moments look like children's squabbles. She stood slowly, and the chamber's attention shifted to her. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 2 centuries ago. Most species viewed them as energetic but ultimately insignificant, useful primarily for their adaptability and surprising military prowess in small conflicts. "High Chancellor," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the vast chamber without any artificial amplification. "Has the Hegemony Science Collective actually attempted to study the plague directly, or are these models based on remote observations?" Vexitar's mandibles clicked in what humans had learned to recognize as annoyance. "Ambassador Chen, surely you cannot suggest that any reasonable species would risk direct contact with such a catastrophic phenomenon. The risk of contamination is absolute." "That's interesting," Sarah replied, pulling up a holographic display from her personal tablet. "Because 3 weeks ago, the human research vessel Endurance completed a thorough investigation of the Kepler 442 system, which was declared infected and scheduled for sterilization. Would you like to see what we found?" The chamber fell silent. Even the constant background hum of environmental systems seemed to quiet. The Endurance mission had been conducted without galactic approval or knowledge, a fact that Sarah could see dawning on faces across the assembly. The holographic display showed detailed scans of planets that should have been consumed by the Void Plague. Instead, the images revealed something entirely different. Massive organic structures growing across planetary surfaces, complex energy patterns that pulsed with an almost musical rhythm, and most shocking of all, clear evidence of transformed but very much alive ecosystems. "The Void Plague isn't a disease," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "It's a metamorphosis. The affected systems aren't dying, they're evolving into something we don't understand yet, and according to our xenobiologist team, the transformation appears to be voluntary at the cellular level." High Chancellor Vexatar's posture shifted, his previous authority replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "Impossible. Our sensors clearly showed the cessation of all recognizable life signs." "Your sensors showed the cessation of life as you define it," Sarah corrected. "But life, as we've learned throughout history, has a way of being far more creative than we expect." Dr. James Martinez, the human delegation's chief scientist, stood and activated his own display. "We found evidence of communication networks spanning entire continents, energy exchanges that suggest some form of collective consciousness, and most importantly, we found survivors. Original inhabitants of these worlds who chose to undergo the transformation and are now thriving in ways we're only beginning to understand." The revelation hit the assembly like a shockwave. Representatives began speaking in urgent whispers, translators working overtime to keep up with the sudden burst of multilingual discussion. The implications were staggering. If the humans were correct, then the hegemony's solution wasn't preventing genocide. It was committing it. Vexatar's voice cut through the chaos with desperate authority. "These claims are unsubstantiated and dangerous. Even if some form of life persists, it is clearly no longer the life we recognize or can coexist with. The quarantine and sterilization protocol must proceed." "Based on what?" Sarah's voice carried a hardness that made several nearby representatives flinch. "Based on fear? Based on your inability to understand something new? Since when did the Galactic Assembly decide that different equals dangerous?" The luminal representative, a being of pure energy, flickered in patterns that translated as concern. "Ambassador Chen, while your research is surprising, surely you must acknowledge the risks of allowing such an unknown phenomenon to spread unchecked." Sarah looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes or optical sensors of as many representatives as she could. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of all classifications, I want to share something with you, a perspective that might be unique to humanity's experience." She paused, letting the chamber settle into expectant silence. "Throughout our history, we've faced plagues, disasters, and changes that seemed like the end of everything we knew. And yes, sometimes they were devastating, but more often than not, they were growing pains, evolution in action, the transition from one stage of existence to another. "But what if we're wrong?" called out the Centaurian delegate, her scaled features twisted with worry. "What if this transformation is hostile? What if it spreads to our worlds?" "Then we adapt," Sarah replied simply. "We study, we learn, we grow. That's what life does. It doesn't run from change. It embraces it." High Chancellor Vextar rose to his full imposing height, his voice taking on the formal tones of official condemnation. "The hegemony cannot and will not accept the risk posed by allowing this phenomenon to continue unchecked. The sterilization protocol will commence in 72 standard hours, with or without assembly approval." The chamber erupted. Representatives leaped to their feet. Translation systems struggled with the cacophony of voices, and the careful diplomatic order of the assembly began to crumble. Through it all, Sarah Chen stood quietly, watching as the true nature of galactic politics revealed itself. When the chaos finally settled, it was the Aquatic Confederation's representative who spoke first. "Surely there must be a compromise. Some way to study this phenomenon while maintaining appropriate safety protocols." Vextar's response was swift and final. The hegemony's position is non-negotiable. Any species that attempts to interfere with the sterilization protocol will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The hegemony controlled the most advanced military fleet in known space, and everyone in the chamber knew it. For all their talk of democratic process and collective decision-making, the Assembly had always deferred to hegemony's strength when push came to shove. Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She looked at her fellow humans around the table, seeing the same realization in their eyes. They had come here hoping for wisdom, for cooperation, for the kind of galactic community that humanity had dreamed of joining since they first looked up at the stars. Instead, they had found cowardice dressed up as pragmatism and genocide disguised as necessity. Dr. Martinez leaned close to her ear. "Sarah, our research shows clear signs of intelligence in the transformed systems. If we allow this sterilization to proceed, we'll be complicit in the destruction of possibly the most significant evolutionary leap in galactic history." Sarah nodded slowly, her decision crystallizing. She had spent her entire career believing in diplomacy, in the power of reason and negotiation to solve even the most complex problems. But some lines couldn't be crossed, and some evils couldn't be compromised with. She stood once more, and this time her movement carried a finality that made the entire chamber take notice. "High Chancellor Vextar," she said, her voice carrying across the vast space with perfect clarity. "The human delegation formally requests a delay of the sterilization protocol pending further investigation." "Request denied," Vextar replied immediately. "Then humanity formally withdraws its support for this action." "Noted and irrelevant." Sarah looked around the chamber one more time, seeing fear, uncertainty, and in too many faces, the willingness to look the other way, as long as someone else made the hard choices. "In that case," she said, gathering her materials and signaling to the rest of the human delegation, "humanity withdraws from this assembly." The words fell into the chamber like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread from species to species. Withdrawing from the assembly wasn't just a protest, it was a declaration that humanity rejected the entire framework of galactic civilization as it currently existed. As the 12 humans walked toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent chamber, Sarah could feel the weight of 437 civilizations watching them go. Behind her, she heard Vextar's voice calling for order, demanding that the session continue, insisting that humanity's departure changed nothing. But Sarah knew better. In her 30 years of diplomatic service, she had learned to read the currents of power and fear that moved beneath the surface of official proceedings. And right now, those currents were shifting in ways that would reshape the galaxy. As the massive doors of the assembly chamber sealed shut behind them, Dr. Martinez spoke the question that was on all their minds. "Sarah, what have we just done?" She paused in the corridor, looking back at the closed doors one last time. "We've just reminded the galaxy that some principles are worth more than safety. Now we need to prove that we meant it." The human delegation walked away from the center of galactic power, and in their wake, they left behind a silence that would soon give way to the storm. The ripple effect. The news of humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Assembly spread across known space faster than any quantum communication network. Within hours, every major world station and colony had received word that the youngest species in galactic politics had just walked away from the most powerful institution in the galaxy. On the crystalline spires of Hegemony Prime, High Chancellor Vextar paced in his private chambers, his mandibles clicking in rapid patterns that his advisors had learned to recognize as deep agitation. The holographic display before him showed feeds from across the galaxy, and every single one carried the same message: uncertainty. How are the other species responding? He demanded of his intelligence coordinator, a sleek Vorthak whose serpentine form coiled around a gravity manipulation device. Mixed reactions, Chancellor, the coordinator replied, her forked tongue tasting the air nervously. The Aquatic Confederation has called for an emergency session to discuss alternative approaches to the void plague. The Zentaran Trade Union is questioning whether the sterilization protocol is economically sound. Most concerning, 17 minor species have formally requested additional time to review the situation. Vextar's compound eyes focused on the intelligence feeds with laser intensity. And the humans themselves? That's more complicated. Our surveillance shows their ships departing assembly space, but they're not returning to human territory. They're heading toward the quarantine zone. The Chancellor felt his carapace grow cold. Impossible. No species would be foolish enough to deliberately enter infected space. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. In the 200 years since first contact, humanity had gained a reputation for doing exactly the kinds of things that other species considered impossible or insane. They were the species that had somehow survived and thrived on a planet that regularly tried to kill them through weather, geology, and biology. They were the ones who had developed faster-than-light travel, not through careful theoretical advancement, but by strapping themselves to experimental engines and hoping for the best. They were dangerous precisely because they didn't understand the concept of acceptable losses the way other civilized species did. Meanwhile, aboard the human flagship Determination, Ambassador Sarah Chen stood in the command center watching as her small fleet of 12 ships approached the edge of the quarantine zone. The ships weren't warships in the traditional sense, though they carried enough firepower to defend themselves. Instead, they were research vessels, colony ships, and mobile laboratories, everything humanity would need to conduct the kind of investigation that the Assembly had been too afraid to attempt. Captain Elena Vasquez, a woman whose family had been exploring dangerous space for 4 generations, stood beside Sarah at the observation deck. Ambassador, we're receiving multiple communication attempts from Assembly forces. They're demanding that we halt our approach. Are they threatening to fire on us? Sarah asked. Not yet, but there are 3 hegemony dreadnoughts moving to intercept our course. They'll reach us in 6 hours. Sarah nodded, having expected as much. Vexatar couldn't allow humans to prove him wrong without losing face in front of the entire galaxy, but he also couldn't risk starting a war by firing on civilian research vessels. Any word from the transformed systems? Dr. Martinez looked up from his sensor array, his face filled with excitement. Actually, yes. We're receiving some kind of signal from the Kepler 442 system. It's not like anything in our communication protocols, but the pattern suggests intentional transmission. Can we decode it? Working on it. But Sarah, the energy signature is massive. Whatever is sending this signal, it's using the power output of an entire star to do it. The implications hung in the air like electricity before a storm. If the transformed systems were capable of stellar-scale engineering, then they represented a level of advancement that dwarfed anything in known space. More importantly, they were actively trying to communicate. 3 hours later, the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Lisa Park, the team's xenolinguist, had been running the signal through every translation matrix they had. But the solution hadn't come from language analysis. It had come from music. It's not a language in any traditional sense, she explained to the assembled senior staff. It's a mathematical symphony, complex harmonics that encode information through frequency relationships. Once I started analyzing it as music rather than speech, the patterns became clear. She activated the translation, and the bridge filled with sounds unlike anything human ears had ever heard. It was beautiful and alien, like the song of whales mixed with the resonance of crystal caves and the rhythm of heartbeats. But underneath the beauty was unmistakable meaning. Welcome, young swimmers in the cosmic sea. We have been waiting for those who would dare to understand rather than destroy. The message continued, explaining in concepts that stretched human understanding to its limits. The Void Plague wasn't a disease or even a single phenomenon. It was a collective awakening, a voluntary transformation that allowed entire ecosystems to transcend the limitations of individual biology and become something greater. The affected species had chosen to abandon their physical forms and merge into vast, interconnected consciousnesses that spanned solar systems. But most importantly, they weren't spreading by force. They were offering transformation to any who chose it willingly, while respecting the choice of those who preferred to remain as they were. "My God," whispered Captain Vasquez. "They're not invaders. They're missionaries." Dr. Martinez was staring at the data streams with wide eyes. The energy patterns we detected aren't weapons or viral transmissions. They're invitations. They've been broadcasting across the galaxy, trying to explain what they've become. But the signal is so advanced that most species' technology can't even detect it, let alone translate it. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the full magnitude of what was happening. That's why the hegemony's sensors showed dead systems. They weren't looking for the right kind of life. And that's why they want to sterilize everything, Captain Vasquez added grimly. If this gets out, if the galaxy discovers that the hegemony nearly committed genocide against the most advanced civilization in known space, their authority will collapse overnight. The communication from the transformed systems continued, and with each translated phrase, the scope of the tragedy became clearer. The beings that had once been separate species were now part of something that could only be described as a cosmic-scale organism, capable of manipulating matter and energy on unimaginable scales. They had been trying to share their knowledge with the galaxy, to offer the choice of transformation to any who wanted it. Instead, they had been met with fear and the threat of annihilation. "Sarah," Dr. Martinez said quietly, "we need to get this information back to Earth, and to every other species in the galaxy. This isn't just about stopping a genocide. This is about fundamentally changing our understanding of what life can become." Before Sarah could respond, the ship's communications officer called out urgently, "Ambassador, we're receiving a priority transmission from the Hegemony fleet. They're demanding our immediate withdrawal and threatening to open fire if we proceed." Sarah looked around the bridge at her crew, at the brave men and women who had followed her into what might be the most important moment in galactic history. "Options?" Captain Vasquez checked her tactical displays. "We can outrun them. Human ships are faster than hegemony dreadnoughts. But if they're willing to fire on us, we won't be able to stay and conduct proper research. And if we withdraw, then the sterilization proceeds as planned, and the most significant discovery in galactic history dies with billions of transformed beings who just wanted to share their gift with the universe." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an entire species' future resting on her shoulders. When she opened them again, her decision was clear. "Captain Vasquez, proceed into the quarantine zone at maximum speed. Dr. Martinez, prepare every sensor we have. We're going to get as much data as possible before they can stop us." "Sarah," Dr. Park said softly, "if we do this, there's no going back. We'll be branded as rogue actors, possibly traitors to galactic stability." "Good," Sarah replied with a grim smile, "because sometimes stability is just another word for comfortable stagnation. And sometimes the only way to save civilization is to remind it what it's supposed to stand for." The Determination and its escort ships surged forward into space that no one else in the galaxy dared to enter. Behind them, hegemony dreadnoughts accelerated in pursuit, their weapons charging for what might be the first shots of a new kind of war. But ahead of them lay something more important than any military conflict. Ahead lay the transformed systems, where beings that had once been individual species had chosen to become something greater than the sum of their parts. They were waiting with infinite patience for someone, anyone, to be brave enough to listen to their story. As the human fleet crossed into quarantined space, the transformed beings reached out with gentle tendrils of communication, wrapping the ships in protective fields of energy that no weapon in the hegemony arsenal could penetrate. For the first time in the crisis, the beings that had been condemned as a plague spoke directly to their would-be destroyers, and what they had to say would change everything. Back in assembly space, the news feeds were beginning to carry reports of what the humans were discovering. The carefully controlled narrative of a deadly plague was starting to crack as independent journalists and scientists began asking uncomfortable questions. How had humanity's primitive technology succeeded where the hegemony's advanced sensors had failed? Why were the humans willing to risk everything to protect something that was supposedly an existential threat? Most dangerously for the established order, some species were beginning to ask whether they wanted to be the kind of civilization that destroyed what it didn't understand. The ripples spreading out from humanity's withdrawal were becoming waves, and those waves were about to become a tsunami that would reshape the political landscape of the entire galaxy. The New Dawn. The Galactic Assembly Chamber had never seen anything like it. For the first time in its 1,000-year history, the Great Dome was packed beyond capacity, with representatives from species that hadn't attended a session in centuries standing alongside newly contacted civilizations that had never set foot in assembly space before. The careful seating arrangements had been abandoned in favor of a massive circular gathering that put every delegate on equal footing. At the center of it all sat not High Chancellor Vextar, but a simple holographic projection showing the transformed Kepler 442 system in all its impossible beauty. Vast organic structures stretched between planets like living bridges, energy patterns danced across the surfaces of worlds in colors that had no names, and throughout it all pulsed a rhythm that observers swore they could feel in their bones. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood before the assembly, but she was no longer alone. Beside her were representatives from 43 species that had broken ranks with the hegemony in the weeks since humanity's withdrawal. The Aquatic Confederation had been the first to demand an independent investigation. The Zentaran Trade Union had followed, motivated as much by the potential profits of peaceful contact as by ethical concerns. But it was the smaller species, the ones who had always lived in fear of the hegemony's power, who had surprised everyone by finding their voices. "Honored delegates," Sarah began, her words carrying clearly through the massive space. 3 weeks ago, humanity walked out of this assembly because we could not stand by while genocide was committed in our name. Today we return not as supplicants seeking readmission, but as witnesses to the most profound discovery in galactic history. She gestured to the holographic display, which shifted to show the data that human researchers had gathered during their time in the transformed systems. The beings you know as the Void Plague are not a disease. They are not invaders. They are teachers, offering a gift to any species wise enough to listen. High Chancellor Vextar, whose position had grown increasingly precarious as more species questioned his leadership, rose from what had once been his throne, but was now just another seat in the circle. Ambassador Chen, while your data is interesting, surely you cannot expect this assembly to risk the safety of trillions based on the claims of beings whose very nature we cannot comprehend. Can't we? The voice came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Zareth, the hegemony's own chief xenobiologist, stood from the hegemony delegation. Her presence at the podium sent shockwaves through the assembly, as she was known to be one of Vextar's most trusted advisors. "Dr. Zareth," Vextar's voice carried a warning that everyone in the chamber could hear. "With respect, Chancellor, I can no longer remain silent. Dr. Zareth activated her own display, showing data that made several delegates gasp in surprise. For the past 2 weeks, I have been analyzing the information that humanity has shared, and I have confirmed their findings through independent research. The display showed the results of careful analysis, conducted using the hegemony's most advanced scientific equipment. The transformed systems weren't just alive, they were thriving in ways that defied conventional understanding of biology and physics. More importantly, they were demonstrably benevolent. The transformed beings have had countless opportunities to spread their influence by force, Dr. Zareth continued. They possess energy manipulation capabilities that could easily overwhelm our defenses. Instead, they have remained in their designated systems, patiently waiting for others to understand their message. "And what message is that?" called out the Centaurian delegate, her scaled features twisted with genuine curiosity. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, his voice filled with wonder. "They're offering evolution. Not forced transformation, but voluntary transcendence. They've discovered a way to merge individual consciousness into something greater while retaining the unique perspectives that make each species valuable." The chamber erupted in discussion as representatives struggled to process the implications. The idea of voluntary consciousness merger was not unknown to galactic civilization, but it had always been theoretical. To discover that it was not only possible, but had already been achieved by multiple species, was staggering. The luminal representative, whose energy-based physiology made them perhaps the most qualified to understand the transformation, flickered in patterns that translated as amazement. "Are you suggesting that individual identity can be maintained within a collective consciousness?" "Not just maintained," Sarah replied, "enhanced. Each transformed being retains their original memories, personality, and perspective, but gains access to the experiences and knowledge of every other being in their collective. They become simultaneously individual and universal." "But surely there are risks," protested the delegate from the Cautious Coalition, a group of species known for their conservative approach to new technologies. "What happens to those who choose not to transform? Are they cast aside? Seen as inferior?" Dr. Zareth smiled, the expression looking strange on her usually serious features. "That's perhaps the most remarkable part. The transformed beings show no desire to force their gift on others. They view non-transformed species not as lesser beings, but as valued partners in the cosmic community. They need us to remain as we are, to provide the diversity of thought and experience that keeps the universe interesting." The revelation changed the entire dynamic of the debate. Fear began to give way to curiosity, and curiosity to wonder. If the transformed beings truly posed no threat and offered only benefits to those who chose to accept them, then the sterilization protocol wasn't just morally wrong, it was catastrophically short-sighted. But it was the next revelation that truly shattered the old paradigms. Captain Vasquez stepped forward, her expression grave. "There's something else. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about galactic history." She activated a new display, showing star charts that stretched back millions of years. The transformed beings shared their historical records with us. The phenomenon we call the Void Plague isn't new. It's been happening periodically throughout galactic history, whenever a sufficient number of species achieve the necessary technological and philosophical development. The implication hung in the air like a charged field. Ancient civilizations, the mysterious builders of massive structures found throughout the galaxy, the legendary species that had vanished without explanation, they hadn't died out or transcended to other dimensions. They had chosen transformation. "You're suggesting," said the Aquatic Confederation's representative slowly, "that galactic civilization goes through cycles of individual development followed by collective transcendence?" "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "And we're currently approaching one of those transition points. The reason the transformation is beginning now is that enough species have achieved the necessary level of development. We're on the verge of a galactic awakening. High Chancellor Vextar's mandibles clicked frantically as he processed the implications. If this was true, then the hegemony's entire power structure was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of cosmic development. More importantly, it meant that trying to prevent the transformation was like trying to stop evolution itself. Even if this is true, he said desperately, surely not every species is ready for such a transformation. The chaos alone would destroy galactic civilization as we know it. You're right, Sarah agreed, surprising everyone in the chamber. Not every species is ready, and that's perfectly fine. The transformation isn't mandatory or even universal. It's simply an option for those who choose it. Dr. Zareth nodded in agreement. Our analysis suggests that roughly 30% of current galactic species show the necessary development indicators. The rest can continue developing at their own pace, with the support and guidance of their transformed neighbors. The debate continued for hours, but the tide had clearly turned. Species after species rose to voice support for peaceful contact with the transformed systems. The Zentaran Trade Union spoke of the economic benefits of cooperation with beings capable of stellar-scale engineering. The artistic collective was fascinated by the creative possibilities of merged consciousness. Even the military-focused warrior clans expressed interest in learning from beings who had achieved victory over death itself. As the day wore on, it became clear that the hegemony's position was untenable. The sterilization protocol, once seen as a necessary evil, was now viewed as an attempt to prevent the natural evolution of galactic civilization. Worse, it was an attempt to maintain power by destroying what couldn't be controlled. The final blow came when the transformed beings themselves addressed the assembly directly. The vast chamber filled with the same musical communication that had first been translated by humanity, but now enhanced by the collective translation efforts of dozens of species. The message was simple, profound, and undeniable. We are your children grown to adulthood. We are your friends who have found a new way of being. We are your future, waiting patiently for you to join us when you are ready. We ask nothing but understanding. We offer everything we have learned. The choice, as always, is yours. When the music faded, the chamber remained silent for long moments. Then, slowly, species after species rose to speak, not in debate or argument, but in acceptance of a new reality. The old galactic order, based on fear and competition for limited resources, was giving way to something unprecedented. A civilization based on choice, growth, and infinite possibility. High Chancellor Vextar, seeing the inevitable, made the only choice left to him. The hegemony formally withdraws the sterilization protocol and offers to participate in peaceful contact initiatives with the transformed systems. The chamber erupted in applause, but Sarah felt no triumph. Too much had been risked, too much nearly lost, for this to feel like victory. Instead, it felt like the first tentative steps toward something larger than any single species could achieve alone. In the months that followed, the galaxy transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Trade agreements were established with the transformed systems, leading to technological advances that would have taken centuries to achieve independently. Cultural exchange programs allowed individuals from various species to experience temporary connection with collective consciousness, returning with perspectives that enriched their entire civilizations. Most importantly, the constant fear that had driven galactic politics for millennia began to fade. When death was no longer permanent and resources could be created rather than fought over, the old reasons for conflict simply became irrelevant. Not every species chose transformation immediately. Humanity itself was divided, with some individuals eager to explore collective consciousness while others preferred to remain traditionally human. But the choice was respected, and the diversity was celebrated. Ambassador Sarah Chen, now serving as humanity's representative to the newly formed Galactic Cooperation Council, often stood at the observation deck of the station that had replaced the old assembly building. Through the transparent aluminum walls, she could see the transformed Kepler 442 system in the distance, its impossible beauty a constant reminder of what courage and curiosity could achieve. "Any regrets?" asked Dr. Martinez, joining her at the window. He had chosen partial transformation, maintaining his individual consciousness while gaining access to the collective knowledge of thousands of researchers across multiple species. Sarah smiled, thinking of that day 3 months ago when she had walked out of the assembly chamber with no idea what would come next. "Just one. I wish we had been brave enough to take this step sooner." Behind them, the galaxy continued its work of becoming something greater than the sum of its parts, and for the first time in cosmic history, the future felt not like a threat to be feared but like a gift to be embraced. The silence that had followed humanity's departure from the assembly had indeed given way to a storm, but it had been a storm of transformation, washing away the old fears and prejudices to reveal the infinite potential that had always existed in the space between the stars.